tonight we have Cheryl talking about her work and the state of the Minnesota Rover woodlot. Some of you may not know, Minnesota's adopted a woodlot. We've been doing a lot of work on it over the years, and Cheryl has spearheaded a lot of this effort. All of the buckhorn's been removed, a lot of invasive species work has been done, and now some of the natural species are starting to come back. Cheryl has been a longtime rover, a member of the board, a past president. She enjoys climbing and hiking, and has really been key in making things work at the woodlot. And so it's really exciting to hear all of the news about that. Welcome, Cheryl. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So this woodlot was started back in 2014. And I'm going to update you on the progress that's made up until now in April here. And this woodlot was initially started by 3 core rovers, Tom Harris, Jim Peterson, and myself. And then we usually do anywhere from 1 to 3 group rover things a year, doing with conservation, either garlic mustard pulling or buckthorn removal or tree and shrub planting. So this year we did some tree and shrub planting, and I'll show you what at least what the group looked like this year. I'm terrible at remembering to take pictures at the events. I'm trying to get better. This picture is taken by a friend of mine, Gary Conant, and he's a amateur wildlife photographer, and he at my request, takes pictures of things at the woodlot and forwards them to me. So that's a barred owl. The thing about the core group who started this woodlot, we're mountain bikers, and this is the core of it is part of original oak mesic forest, but it's also part of the mountain bike trail at Elm Creek. So our goals for doing this was to restore the oak mesic 2% that exists in Minnesota to its pre-buckthorn state, and let this be enjoyed by the recreational public and showcase it to the public. This is where it's located, that red dot there. Oh, there we go. And then here you see in yellow the core of the woodlot, which is 24 acres. And then my goal for, I think to 2015, it's a little bit more than what I currently have cleared, what we as a group have cleared, but it's close to it in red. This shows the land classification, the brown being the good parts where there's wild forbs and native trees, and this is the goal of restoring that area. And then the idea of expanding out from there is to protect that core of the woodlot from invasives. Here you can see what the land looked like in 1971, which was just before Elm Creek became part of the Three Rivers Park system. And then I put the core 24 acres here in black. So you can see that this, and I've got historical photos back to, I think 1930, 1950 for sure, that show that this was still oak forest. So some of those trees had never been removed, but that the surrounding land is not as ideal. This is farmland surrounding here, and here the stuff in light is where they had initially drained some of these areas. And so anyway, you'd be surprised what comes back even in the farmland once it's cleared of the buckthorn. There are some cool natives at the woodlot. Nodding trillium is one of them. We also have Indian pipe up on the right there that people generally think that's a fungus. It's usually about 2 inches. It's pretty cool looking, actually considered a forb, sort of a flower. There's several orchids on the woodlot. There's quite a few mushrooms, many different varieties, jack in the pulpit, all kinds of forbs, lots of spring ephemerals, which this year I usually try and time it to the ephemerals, but the weather's been too goofy this year, so most of them weren't out yet. Lots of columbine has come back. There are some morels, though you'll never find them if you don't know where to look. And there's some big blue stem in the southern part of the woodlot. I also run the camera traps at Elm Creek, and I've positioned some of them on the woodlot. So over the years, I haven't gotten a picture of the fisher on here, but there's a fisher that has visited the woodlot a couple of years ago. There's mink, coyote, weasels, possums, coons. This is taken by another friend of mine, Joel Baker, who's a very good photographer. And this is a barred owl owlet, so a baby barred owl. Every year since I've been there, there's been at least one barred owl family on the woodlot. There's also nesting there. There's often broadwing, and for sure, there's always Cooper's hawk nesting on the woodlot. Tundra swans fly over. They often land in the northern marsh. And here we've got some mallard ducks and pheasant. Those were taken this winter. That's the original picture of the barred owl. So up here is the Cooper's hawk. When you see them, oftentimes they look kind of bluish, depending on how the sun is hitting them. Red-shouldered hawk also doesn't nest there, but often visits. And that's considered a special species of concern. There's solid owls in the south. If anybody's a serious birder, I can tell you where these birds are usually seen on the woodlot. Sandhill cranes, they're in the northern marsh, and when we were doing the tree and shrub planting, we could hear some of them, and they flew overhead later in our walk. Oh, I spelled pileata woodpecker wrong. Also on the walk that we just did, pretty sure we saw a northern shrike that flew by. I hadn't seen him in a couple years, but he's often there too. And on the lower right-hand corner there, you can see Cooper's hawk babies. That's usually 1 to 2 nests every year. And then some of the trees that are there are, of course, the red oak, sugar maple, there's elm trees. A lot of there's white oak also. So the inventory on the woodlot, if anybody in this group has an interest in botany or they're master naturalists, they want to take on a project, the new areas that have recently adopted still need to be gone through and list the different species that are on there of forbs, the wildflowers, and anybody knows sedges and grasses. I have not kept up with the inventory for the last couple years, but there's at least 45 different trees and bushes, 9 different grasses, sedges, and rushes that I and others have ID'd, 34 different mushrooms, 60 different birds, so, and going on and on. So there's lots of diversity here, and that's native. The recently adopted areas are also, yeah, they're just, they're coming up, and there's new stuff in there because it's a little bit different land. So here's a picture during one of the buckthorn clearings. This is what it looked like before, and then after the rovers were done clearing. So you can see 2 rovers back there working. So a lot of work has been done. Started out with nothing cleared, and we're now up to 51 acres. We initially did some bud cap research in order to prove that cages would be beneficial. So now we've got some cages out there. So some of the choice native forbs and trees can grow. We've gathered in with permission from Three Rivers. We've gathered and planted native seeds and spread them out just to help things come back a little bit better. We've also done some extensive mapping of good native seed sources. Tom Harris did a study on buckthorn berries, and they're viable. They become viable in July. So if you are clearing land, you want to get them out of there, get the mothers out by July, unless otherwise you got another year of seed bed there going. Some of the other stuff, one of the big projects has been clearing the invasive surrounding the woodlot to prevent them from coming into the woodlot. So I've expanded out that every year. I'm probably close to the limit of my expansion ability as one person at this point, but it's gone out pretty far. The seed beds, it's becoming less and less, thankfully. And do the trail cameras to see what's going on wildlife wise. Let's see what else. Oh, we got an ABA deer study. This is through the U of M. The deer study studies deer browse in regards to native plants, and see how that is based on what kind of vegetation you got going on. That's a statewide study going on, and there's 2 research plots going on in the Minnesota Rover Woodlot. Also in 2019 started the Cover Up site. Cover Up is another statewide research study studying vegetation, that if you clear the buckthorn and then plant native forbs, how well does it hold back the buckthorn from coming back? 2021 woodlot goals for this year: continue to remove the seed bed of the target species, plant mid-canopy shrubs and trees on the northern edge of the marsh. We just did that. Also, there's another area I want to do, which is primarily, it's near the dog park, and that's more of just a be nice to the neighbors sort of thing, get them on our side. Continue the research studies. I'm going to plan to remove some of the cages that are no longer necessary from what I've caged, and remove them to the planting site that we just did this year. And remove the buckthorn and honeysuckle. Yeah, just more invasive removal. And then hopefully get 5 more acres removed. It'd actually be 4 acres. My goal is 55 acres this year for a total of 5. So this is where it started. 2014, we started removing, and 1 year later, this is how much we removed from the core of the woodlot. And here it is going out. Pink is fully removed, and the other colors are various stages of removal. We tried to go through and get the mothers out every year. More progress in 17. 18, we completed it, which was cool, but Three Rivers was like, well, you're going to keep expanding, right? So then we started expanding out more. And that's what it looked like last year, even during COVID, which was a really unusual year. Could not clear for, I think, about 4 months, which put everything very far behind. So here's a different view of what was removed. So here's the northern marsh that I talk about. There's another little pond marsh here. And oh, and here's the Oops. Here's the dog park area. So, and there's a fence and barrier. So, okay. This is the removal as of April. And then usually once a year, other than last year, we've always gotten the CCM crew, which is Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa. They are hired, I think, via grant through Three Rivers. And I usually get them out once, maybe twice a year to do some clearings. And they wanted to have trees. And believe it or not, oops, there's not a lot of trees, buckthorn trees on the woodlot areas anymore, at least for the next couple of years in my clearing areas. So this area, they removed buckthorn and honeysuckle. So that's on my priority list to continue to stack up the wood that they did and clear that area out. Further help them out. This is an invasive, I wish I could remove this top part, but anyway, this is an invasive species removal map. And as you can see, there's quite a few invasives that working on removing. And here you can see the core of the woodlot. And then here's what's the boundary of what's already been removed this year. And thankfully, most of this is very minor at this point, but still working on the seed bed. Here's the group that removed the trees and shrubs. And they were quite a really nice group. It was fun. We did about, planted about 150 shrubs of various species and also some ostrich fern. So here's the woodlot clearing goal for 2021. So 55 acres total, just another view of it. And then the broad view is to 2030. And the reason choosing this area is this is also oak mesic, and this is oak mesic as a base. So there should be good forbs that come back after removing the buckthorn. All right, that is it. I'll take questions if anybody has any.
Cheryl, you had mentioned something about the red-shouldered hawk or something like that being a troubled species or something. Could you reiterate and then kind of expand on what you meant by that?
So there's different designations the Minnesota DNR puts out, or maybe it's the Minnesota Biological Survey. Somebody in Minnesota makes the designation that certain species are threatened. If they're not actually threatened, like the timber wolf was threatened for a while, the next status before they're threatened is where the red-shouldered hawk is. It's called special species of concern.
Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else?
I was wondering on the buckthorn, is there a special, a lot of people have talked to me about buckthorn, and is there a lot of special way of removing that, or?
Yeah, so the history of this woodlot is we had approval. You can do it a number of ways, okay? You could get a goat, and then from now until, I don't know, it sounds like probably 7 years minimum, you'd have to have those goats out there eating the buckthorn, and they'll eat everything. So you have to train them. So somebody's got to be herding them to avoid the good stuff and go after the buckthorn. So you can do that. That's one method. The other is to use a special pole sort of wench thing. And those work. Those who don't want to use chemicals will use those. It does a lot of soil disturbance, and this woodlot has quite a few hills, and the problem with doing that is it can erode, cause a lot of erosion, a lot of soil disturbance, and you can get invasives coming in because you did the soil disturbance. But that's one way too. And if you want to avoid chemicals, that's what's done at Murphy. Hammerhand, we have a poll coming up in June there by Mike Sweet. What we've done on this woodlot is I've tried the wenches. For me, it's a little bit too much effort, but I have them available, or one available. And for erosion control purposes, I don't use them that much either. A lot of this, the buckthorn, the smaller buckthorn, you can just pull. And if you can pull it, that's really great, and that's the best. But if you can't pull it, then you cut it and treat it. And we use Landscape Restoration sells buckthorn blasters. They're basically bingo dabbers. And you can just apply it directly on the trunk. If it's a big trunk, you just apply it on the edge for like a ½ inch around the edge. And you cut it down as far as to the ground as you can, and then you apply it. The smaller the branch that you're cutting, the more likely it is to regrow. The chemical, if you go through landscape restorations, what they'll recommend is Roundup. That's what Three Rivers used to use. What I discovered is that before Three Rivers banned Roundup is that the Roundup, there's something at least at Elm Creek that it's like it doesn't work as well as what it's the mixture it says on the container. You have to do it at a higher level of concentration so that it doesn't regrow. I didn't really like Roundup. If for no other reason than that, it seemed to have, you had to make it more potent. It's like it was becoming immune to the chemical.
Okay.
We use Triciphlor. That's the chemical we use. It has a lot less, it's healthier for the people using it, but of course you wear gloves and to keep the chemical. And when you're just dabbing it on, it's pretty hard to get it on yourself unless that bottle were to break, which typically only happens in the winter. You could get a crack in it. I've never had that happen, but I know it's happened to other people. So,
Hey, Cheryl, have you heard of Garland 4? It's made
yeah,
by,
that's the same thing.
okay.
Garland 3 and 4. So 4 is for the winter, 3 is for the summer.
Okay. Yeah. It was like 14 years ago, I ran a really small business with my brother removing buckthorn in Afton, our hometown. And the person that started the company was just a neighbor. And we did a lot of mechanical removal first. So cutting and then a little bit of some mowing, not so much pulling, but we used Garland 4. And for really big stumps, sometimes we just apply it 100% concentrate. But beyond that, for like all the smaller stuff, we would mix it with water to the right ratio. But yeah, so the guy that started that business said that he chose not to use Roundup because he said that's salt based versus Garland is ester based. So the ester base is supposed to degrade faster and specifically target broadleaf forest plants. So it's supposed to be a little more eco-friendly as much as a herbicide can be. Yeah.
So you talk about mowing. I did do a research plot, weed whipping. I think most people, when they do it, if it's thicker, that you're talking more of a brush cutter kind of situation. But I discovered that it seemed like you'd be doing it years and years and years. To me, I quickly found out that it was more labor intensive. I don't know what your discovery was, but it was more labor intensive to weed whack that area than to just take the time and clear it all out of the buckthorn. That's what I do. And that's what Tom and Jim, they've moved on to other woodlots, but they also, well, they work sometimes at the Rover one. But it just seems like it's the quickest way to get that. If you're willing to do the work, just get it all to sprout, go back, clear it, every 3 years. That's what I do. All right. If anybody's interested in a buckthorn bowl, the next one is May 15th. And you can use chemicals or you cannot use chemicals. If you're not using chemicals, you'll pull it. So,
Hey, Cheryl.
yeah.
Great presentation. There's a question in the chat that says, how much volunteer work is done on hands and knees?
How much work is done on hands and knees? That depends on what you're cutting, the maturity of that buckthorn. So myself, I've known people that'll wear like knee pads. If you're pulling, depending on how good that soil is, you can do a lot of that without being on your hands and knees, but you're bending over and pulling. You could do it all that way. But for me, my back, I just sit down and pull, move around and scoot. But again, it depends on the maturity. You can spend most of your time just doing the trees too. And then there's not much at all. It's getting the seedlings and saplings where you might end up down on the ground. And that basically just depends on your back. If your back's bad, it's probably better to sit down. There's one more way to get rid of buckthorn, and that's to burn it, but you got to be careful. Three Rivers has, you can go to Highland and see an area that's fenced in on the deer fence there. They burned that and it burned too hot, and there's nothing there. It's just grass. So yeah, you really have to know what you're doing if you burn it. But that's one way to do it too.
So a couple more questions. What do you do with the buckthorn that you pull? And do you use chainsaw for buckthorn removal?
Three Rivers will not allow chainsaws. CCM uses chainsaws. If you are doing your own land, chainsaws are great. And you can get a lot done, down and done in a short period of time. I use bow saws, and for me, it works pretty fast too. But yeah, we try every year to get permission to be trained in chainsaws and use chainsaws. What was the other question in that?
What do you do with the buckthorn after?
Oh, so what I do and what Three Rivers allows is we just put them up in a pile and they go down. I've had huge piles up over my head, and you wait till winter and it packs it down, and it packs it down quicker than you would think. And lots of wildlife, the birds like to go in there, lots of mammals like bunnies and things like that. They like to hide in there. And by year 3, depending on how big that pile is, it'll be, even the biggest pile is typically no bigger than waist high at that point. Even the ones that are twice my height, 10, 15 feet high. But you can spend time in getting it much more compact to begin with. I'm kind of lazy. I'll cut down a tree and just chop it up, leave the limbs on, and because I know it packs down pretty good, pretty fast. If you're talking little stuff, you take it off, you shake it, and you need to get it in a pile with the least dirt so that it doesn't re-sprout. If you can get it up into a tree or something, that's even better. Otherwise, that pile might re-sprout and you just if that happens, you just pull the whole pile up and shake it off again and turn it over. I just usually throw that back in the big pile, and that takes care of that. But yeah, as far as trying to get at the seed bed lasts about 7 years, but that's assuming that no bird has put more buckthorn berries on your woodlot. It'll get less and less. I've found, depending on the density of the buckthorn, if it's really dense, I'll come back and do it the next year. And then after that, I can do it every 3 years.
Are there some species you can plant that, they'll kind of take over the space of the buckthorn, or, or is the buckthorn more invasive? And
So that depends on the quality of what you got in native forbs underneath in your soil. And you don't know that really until you take the buckthorn out. So I have been surprised, like the area that we just cleared this spring that I did the shrub planting on, there is a huge native plant base in there, and that's old farmland. I cleared that out, and that whole area is hardly any dirt showing there, even though it was extremely dense in that area. I've cleared other areas, and there's not much seedbed coming back. So it just depends. If nothing's coming back, then what's good to do is contact someplace like Prairie Restorations and say, this is the kind of trees I got growing in my soil. What kind of plants should I put in? If you're a master naturalist, like I am, there's books you can look at. There's also the Minnesota DNR puts out, if you can tell what you got on your land, then you can tell what kind of forbs you should put in based on some of these books the DNR has put out.
By the way, yeah, this is really good. Yeah, good show. Yeah, there's a garden pad is pretty good too for your knees if you want to kneel down, and also good at a twins game too if you're.
Yeah, the amount of buckthorn I pull, I'd have one of those pads shredded to bits in a couple weeks.
No.
But yeah, if you're doing it just occasionally, I'm sure you'd be fine. Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Are there any other questions anyone has? Going once, going twice. Well, thanks very much, Cheryl.
Yep.
Really interesting to see how it's going.